And I'd also like to introduce my co-host again, Pharaoh Saunders, and he's going to talk about, he's going to set a framework. He's going to set the frame for understanding the historical roots and precedent of white supremacy. And also, we've also got to understand the creation of whiteness. So that's what Pharaoh will do today. Pharaoh?
Yeah, thank you, Diane. I think that that's really important to be able to understand where we are now currently as a society and where we can move on from this point. Because in order to get to the contemporary stuff, you have to have the foundation. So to really understand the foundations of white supremacy, like you said, we have to first start with what is whiteness? Where does this concept come from? Where does any of this sort of stuff come from? And so if you're going to be talking about white supremacy, you really can go very far back to try to find a specific discernible point of where you can truly get into that history. But I usually tend to start around 1452. Because 1452 is when the papal bull of Dum Diversas was signed by Pope Alexander V, which was a papal bull allowing for the King of Portugal to subject the Saracens and the pagans to indefinite servitude once captured. And it was the real jumping off point for what the triangle trade would become, which was, of course, started and mostly spearheaded by the Portuguese to begin with as a result of this decree throughout Christendom. You know, so the concept of whiteness and the European identity is really closely tied with Christendom because it is the borders of which were largely defined by where, you know, Christendom ended and either the pagans or the Muslims began. So that's why you see lots of borders throughout Eurasia, because Europe and Asia are the same landmass. You know, there's some mountains, there are a few natural boundaries, but for the most part it's the same landmass. And largely where those distinctions are decided, like where Russia ends and where Asia begins, is based on those lines. That's where you have this checkbox of this is white, and past that becomes other, both to the east and to the south. And as a result of this being based around the laws and culture of this religion, this decree, which allowed for the permanent and indefinite subjugation of peoples, this is the first time it was based on specific race or specific religion in you know, European history. Because prior there's always been slavery everywhere in the world, but this is one of the first prime examples of which it's specifically based on race and religion. That's where it truly starts. And that comes from the same history of Reconquista and choosing to fight against the first repelling the Muslim invaders from Spain, but then going down into Africa and then conquering Africa and continuing this same system. And then that got brought over to the Americas with much of the same thing. So where I'm going with this is that all of these sorts of things, all of these systems are put in place for a nation to build itself up and to propagate its people. None of these nations, very few nations ever, were made with the concept of multiculturalism in mind. That's an afterthought. That gets added far after, once the cultural climate of the era or of the region begins to make that relevant. But most countries in the world are far older than that. Most cultures in the world are far older than that. And those things all get added after. So a major concern in contemporary times about white supremacy is people tend to view white supremacy as an issue of extremist groups. People tend to view white supremacy as something that people on the far end of a spectrum push, rather than it being so deeply embedded in a culture because it's part of the framework of a culture. A culture, by default, is made with the intention of supporting and propagating its people. And what has been defined as its people has changed over time as the concept of multiculturalism has been included into modern society. But the foundations of society, which are not shaken, not removed, not broken, anything like that, those still are what they are. And so that's why you have this system of white supremacy so deep in the bedrock of what we consider modern Western society, because it was always made from the ground up to propagate that, because that's who, at its core, it still considers its people, regardless of who physically or geographically might live in whatever country in the modern day.
So then what we have is a system of white supremacy that was intentionally, and as you said, it never intended or even thought about other people. In fact, the other people that were thought about were intended to be permanently subjugated.
In this specific context, yes, and that's why I mentioned that in this case, because that's a universal thing, really. The idea of multiculturalism didn't exist in the world. That's a modern development, but specifically the context of the subjugation of the others, the other people, that was specifically brought into this context by that decree in which I described, and that's why that's such an important focal point in European history.
And so that's where we are, kind of that's the basic history. And what has happened is essentially nothing has happened to shift that. We've got a papal bull that allowed Christianity to oppress and permanently, according to the papal bull at the time, take the people. And so that began to happen. And the part that makes it so difficult is that we've never, even through slavery and the aftermath of slavery, just looking at the context of the United States, we've never had a program, an intention, or something that came in and interrupted that and said, from this point forward, I mean, we've got some civil rights laws that came in.
But on the culture, so that's why you have very much the same.
So yes, and so now what we have to do, what we see, and what we've talked about here, I've talked about with the panel, is that in fact the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that brought about all these laws, housing laws and transportation laws and all the kind of civil rights laws that said you will not discriminate based on race. But what we did at that time was we said we can't change hearts and minds, and so we're going to change behavior through the laws. And we have been fairly effective doing that. But we've come to the end of that. We've come to the end of the efficacy of changing laws to make a change in our society. And now we have to, people have to change their own hearts and minds. And so what we are about is providing more, we're bringing the white supremacist structure that we live within out of the recesses, up from out of the invisibility, and we're making it visible. And we've got panelists here, and let's just start with the panelists. We're just going to start here from Larry. And so let me ask Larry, and let me ask each panelist, first, as I always do on my program, identify yourself racially, ethnically, and then talk about white supremacy and what that means to you, and what are the things that you have worked on that you would like to share. Larry?
Okay. First of all, thank you for including me on this panel of this important topic. Yep. And I'm thankful as a Somervillian that this program exists and is broadcast. Number one. Number two, identify myself. I'm elderly, white, Jewish, European, school teacher, retired, history teacher. I spent most of my life teaching, dismantling the conventional narrative and trying to offer the alternative narrative and teaching historiography as a way of understanding how history is written and for whom and so forth.
Okay, so could you tell us, what are the things that you have, how do you confront, how do you see white supremacy, and how do you, through being a teacher and educator, what do you do to disrupt that system? Do you see it as a system?
Clearly, I would add to this presentation of Pharaoh's quite interesting beginnings and context that he laid out, the whole issue of capitalism, and how the idea of grabbing Africans, enslaving them, and then grabbing land here to create an agricultural system of cotton production, created American capitalism. And most of, the other thing that I spent my time was teaching, especially as the years went on, was to try to make people aware of the false conceit of American exceptionalism and American innocence, and to, again, offer through teaching and through sharing stories and life narratives, the alternative narrative to the textbook narrative.
What is
Number
that?
one, what?
What is
Exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, American innocence. We're destined to be this. It's Christian-based in many ways, but it's all part of making money out of, and it's all blood money. So, and that's a very hard thing to acknowledge. But you know, there's two parts to this problem. I think, as I was reflecting on how to present myself. One is, you know, to teach the history as we see it and understand it, and then to ask whoever we're teaching how they perceive the history. The second is what is my role? What is the best role for me? And I'm constantly re-examining the role and what my role should be. And I think we live in a very interesting and odd cultural moment right now, and that is that for all of our strongest intent and good faith effort does not matter very much. What matters is impact, and it's the perception of impact that our voice has on others, that our work has on others, that our role as a teacher has on others, and to try to understand that. And a lot of times, the perception of impact that we have is not what we intend that impact to be. And that now is a very, very peculiar situation for us to be in, because you know, we're often criticized as being defining the issue of racism as if we're the experts on racism and we don't understand what that experience really is, that lived experience is for black people. I think what our role is not to try to define that, but to bear witness when we hear and when we see what racism is doing. That's what I feel like our role should be at this point, is to be a witness, not an expert, to be a witness and help others to see what we see.
And here, this is a really important point, and it's one that I want to bring out, and it's one that, so why we have white men as an affinity group, we are all seeing white supremacy through our own experiential lens. And so through this 6 to 8 part series, what we're going to see is what is the lens that we see through as white men, as white women, as black men, as black women. And the reason that there are those basically two groups, white, black, is that black people in this country are at the farthest end of the hatred and the oppression. And so, yes, there are many other people that have been oppressed all over the world, and certainly in this country, but the farthest extremes that we can see through, you know, burning whole towns out, through the whole process of lynching, through the black codes, through particular governmental discrimination, are black people. So we want to bring the invisibility of white supremacy up, and we want to make clear what's going on. We don't have to understand why. Maybe somebody can help with that. But this is the reason for having affinity groups, and this is what these men, thank you very much, volunteered to come here
Could I
today.
just add one more
Yes.
thing? I think the other important thing is power and privilege. I'm writing my memoirs as an activist teacher, and one of the things that I begin with is that when I first started teaching, I fell into it accidentally. I didn't know what black was. I didn't know that I didn't know what black was, and I didn't know that I needed to know what black was. And through teaching and the grace of the students in the community I was teaching in, I started to learn it. But what I didn't understand, even then, it was a greater impediment. It took me a long time to realize is what white is, right? And what my whiteness and privilege is. So I think, besides bearing witness, we have to constantly, as activists, to acknowledge
And white people.
our white, as a white person, our privilege, right? And the power that we have, regardless of whether we feel it or whether we want it to be who we are. It is who we are. It is embedded in our culture. And the difference for each of us is, when someone says, I'm not a racist, the flag should go up. The question is, I'm a racist, and I'm trying to work every way I know how to dismantle it.
Thank you. And let me just make one more comment, and that's what will come out of the other affinity groups as I've felt into this very strongly. We're all racist. So we can get black people on the police force, they're going to act just like they're white people. Because we all grow up in the society. We see the same, we go to the same schools, we don't get the same education, but the same basic kind of education toward American exceptionalism. We see the same beauty standards. We see everything through a white lens of white is right. And we see that, and so we can be black, and we are, and the racism that black people have internally doesn't necessarily shift to be black racism against white people. We're mostly still black racism against white supremacists toward ourselves. And so that's what I want to help bring out in these affinity groups. Black people are afflicted every bit as much with white supremacist virus as white people. So don't look for black people to have all the answers to help you. Black people, we need to figure this out and help ourselves. Each group has to figure out where they fit in this white supremacist structure. So thank you. Bill, can you just start your race and ethnicity and then go from there?
I'm Bill Cavallini. I am a white male. I'm 75 years old. I am Italian-American heritage on both sides. I grew up in the Bronx in New York City. I was a cab driver in Cambridge for 33 years. And I've been a community organizer my entire adult life. Larry said a lot of what I covered a lot of bases.
Repeat it, that's fine.
But I would like to talk about my own personal experience as a cab driver, particularly. The advantages of having a white skin, driving a cab, is pretty. You can't get away from it. It's very right out there in front of your face. When you talk with your fellow drivers, you hear the racism and the stereotyping. I found myself not confronting that at all in the first 7 years of my cab drive. I found myself actually taking advantage knowledgeably of my white skin when a white dispatcher would jump over black drivers and brown drivers who had arrived to the waiting room before me, and I would take the cab. I wouldn't confront the white dispatcher. I wouldn't say anything to the black and brown drivers that I had really taken advantage of because of my white skin. And this happened a number of times before, for one reason or another, I refused to take the cab. And it was just one step on what I see as my journey, to try to understand the depth of my white skin privilege and what it means for people of color in this country. And I took my growing awareness into my community organizing work over the years, whether it was organizing tenants or organizing against MIT expansion and gentrification in Cambridge, and now as the vice chair of the neighborhood council in Union Square over Union Square development. I have to say that this journey that I'm on, and I hear Larry on, and I know that Lou and Alex are probably going to say a similar thing about their journey, is not easy, and it's not a straight line. I go through months where I might be in a situation where there's something very subtle, racist happening, and I'll just ignore it. And then I'll go through a period where I just can't I can't be quiet. And similarly, when issues come up in the community organizing, I might, for a period of time, be very focused on making sure that we're responding, and we as a group are responding to the unique needs of people of color. And then I'll go through periods where somehow I turn, and that's the privilege that I have to do that as a white person. And it doesn't have great repercussions most of the time. So, you know, this is, I'm glad to be part of this. I thank Diane and Pharaoh for this opportunity. It's important work to be doing now more than ever.
So Bill, let me ask you a question, and I think about this a lot because I know your history, and I know that when you moved here, you took the cab driver job because you could work at night, and therefore freeing up your days to be a community organizer. And it's about that community organizing part. So as a white male, and I know some of the people that you worked with in this Cambridge Somerville arena of trying to bring about some kind of equity for people of color, especially in the whole gentrification arena, but also in the MIT case. So tell me, as a white man and looking at a black and brown group of people, how do you, well, let me back up. One of the things that we hear a lot of criticism of white people, and maybe white men, but maybe just all white people in general, is
Mostly
that,
white men.
no, it could be white women too. It depends. See, I connect with a lot of women's groups, and so what the criticism is they just want to take over. They want to come in, and they just see themselves as, you need my leadership. So I'm going to show you. Just follow me. I'll help you. They want to help. I'm going to help you. And so, but they don't see that that's the problem. The problem. So how do you address that?
Listen to me, for one. Listen, that's the first. You know, I think before I came to Cambridge, I was in Vista, in Atlanta, Georgia, and for 2 years. And I looked and I listened a lot, because I knew I had a lot to learn. Even coming up in the Bronx, I grew up in a segregated housing project. So I think the first thing is listening, and not making assumptions. Trying not to make assumptions, but we all make assumptions. We couldn't function if we didn't generalize.
What kind of assumptions? Not making what kinds of assumptions?
Well, assumptions about what people need and want.
Yeah.
You know, I think, and if you have one assumption, the assumption should be there are unique needs of black and brown people in whatever context you're organized. And that you need to listen and to hear what those needs are. So that's the way I would read it.
So we'll come back to those, this is a bigger kind of a question. And so, thank you. Let's move to Alex. And can you tell us race, ethnicity, and then white supremacy? How did that come into being for you, within yourself?
So I'm Alex Peary. I work with immigrants in health in Somerville, Massachusetts, and I identify as male, as WASP. I'm about as WASP as you can get. I know this, and this is partly to do with white privilege. My grandparents.
Is this microphone? Did you?
No.
Oh, wait a minute.
Okay. Is that okay?
I don't know. That's what.
Okay,
That's just the
so
clip.
All right.
okay. Is it still there?
There it is. There.
Okay.
I got it.
Okay.
Okay. So that's all right. I can hang on to it. So where was I?
You were a wasp.
I'm a wasp. So,
Still is.
and I still am. I haven't changed a bit. So, my family has a history going back 10 generations, because my grandparents had the leisure in their retirement years to do a lot of genealogical study. They went to graveyards all over New England. They went to churches where there were accurate records kept, which is something that is not there for most of the people in the African American communities. This is kind of an example of white privilege. The historical record has been written and preserved by white people to the exclusion of all people of color. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think what I wanted to say was to unpack a little bit of the story about myself and when I didn't get woke, because I think it describes things. So let's jump back in time to 1957. I did part of my growing up in a semi-rural, semi-industrial small town in New Hampshire. And it was August. I and a friend were helping to shovel out the chicken, expletive deleted, in the upper floors of his parents' large chicken coop. And we were shoveling it into the back of a truck. And we had got a lot in. We were down in the truck, smoothing it out so we could put more in. And we were talking Amos and Andy, which had been a radio show where black people stereotypically were portrayed by white actors. And then when it went on television, which is kind of when I joined in, it was actually African-American actors, but they preserved the stereotypes. So we were blah, 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 at each other. And all of a sudden, my friend froze. He was looking towards the back of the truck, which was open to the farmyard. And I looked around, and there was the county agent, a guy named Gene, and this very tall, very elegant, very black person in a suit and tie standing next to Gene. And my friend said, oh, and he said, oh, this is so embarrassing because we were pretending to be black, we were jiving each other. And we were like, so we apologize to this guy? So, all right, let's apologize. So we go to the back of the truck, jump down, and walk over. And before we could say anything, Gene says, boys, I'd like you to meet Professor so-and-so. He's an agronomist from Ghana who's here studying at small American farms. And he started to talk. He had this elegant English accent. We were like stunned. And then we realized we shouldn't apologize because he probably thought we were crazy. Anyway, this is a story about myself that I've been unpacking for years because there were issues. I mean, there was an issue, class issue. Here was this unexpectedly elegant upper-class person by accent and dress was black, which was something that we hadn't really thought about. At the same time, although we weren't woke enough to know how wrong we had been, we were aware of being out of line in pretending to be African Americans in this kind of silly way. So I still think about this. Anyway, that's kind of my story.
That's a good unpacking. See, the things that happen in our childhood are the things that are still resonating. We haven't finished unpacking those. But now, tell us about, you felt, you knew that what you just did and said was wrong. What made you know that?
Well, I think that we had, here we were in Honeycook, New Hampshire, with very little experience in the town of people of color, or African Americans of any sort. So we were, at the same time, through the media, there was the civil rights movement unfolding in black and white on television, night after night, through the period of our adolescence. So we were aware, but we didn't connect it to the rest of the world. There were all these sort of, just here was Amos and Andy, here was Martin Luther King, here was all of the other stuff that was going on. So there was no place for us, no moral structure. I mean, this was kind of also white privilege. We could ignore stuff. There was on the television. There was Mossadegh being posed in Iran. There was endless stuff going on in the world that wasn't connected to our day-to-day lives at all, and so we could choose to ignore. However, somewhere in there, the connections were being made.
So bring us up now closer to your age now, up into let's jump over to 60s and jump over to 70s. So how did you find your way? There's plenty of white people that never find their way into the work of being with and bringing skills or developing skills to work with people, black and brown people. So why did you do that?
It's hard to say. I think partly in looking back in the family record, to fully disclose, I had a 10-time great-grandparent who was a slaveholder. I had about a 6- or 7-time great-grandparent who, as the family legend has, although we have no proof, had a hiding place on the Underground Railroad. So there's all these kinds of stories that you sort of accumulate from your own family's experience when you have the privilege to see your family record that way. At the same time, I kind of just stumbled into it through family record and through experiences. So I think probably one of the key places was I was the head carpenter in the scenic shop at Channel 2 when Say Brother, which was a Black Power TV news program, was shut off by Channel 2. And we had a huge row about it. I was part of, I still remember sitting in the cafeteria with the almost entirely white production crew, the cameraman, and I was a floor manager, and then I was the carpenter. And so we were looking out the window at the Say Brothers staff who were sitting outside at a lunch table, clearly angry. This was in the middle of this confrontation with the station. And we were all talking, and we felt that they had been treated badly. So we had a big discussion about what do we do? How do we react? Do we go on strike? We weren't a union, but we could take some kind of action against management to sort of express solidarity. So then I was delegated, I'm sure why, to go out and talk to the Say Brothers staff. So I went out. They were not welcoming. They were very angry, totally understandable. And I had this kind of like semi-woke moment where I thought, I'm not going to tell them all the things that we had suggested to do. What I said was, we think you're right, and what can we do to help? Which I think was like a synapse pop for me at that point. And so anyway, that's kind of another step along that path.
So something happens, and the reason I'm asking this is we have an audience here of people who came because they're interested and concerned, and so these synapses are starting to go off for a lot of people. And we have a video, and so that video will go out to many more people. And we want to give an opportunity for people to have these synapses. Something goes off because we're also in 2019, and we're clearly making enemies with the whole rest of the world. And so things are changing. Things are changing. So how do we heal some of our biggest wounds here in this country, so we can begin to feel like we are people that have some similarity with the rest of the United States. So that's kind of the whole, we're gonna have to work on our own hearts and minds and giving other people a chance to change their hearts and minds. Thank you, Alex. So Lou. Lou. And Lou has consistently raised the issue of not wanting, and this is an important issue within white people, that white people really, if you're learning anything, get this. This is, I'm not an expert on, certainly not on race issues. Don't put me out there as an expert on race issues. These men are experts in their own life journey, and they're sharing that. So Lou can, and Lou keeping me on target to make sure that we're not perceiving people here as experts on race. Not experts on race, but by virtue of birth, experts on white supremacy. So can you talk about your race, ethnicity, and then go on to talk about whatever it is?
Yeah. It's really great to be an expert on white. So my name is Lou Gittleman, Russian, Jewish, culturally Jewish, an educator. I've done all different kinds of things, including being a principal in the Boston Public Schools. So that's my background. I wanted to comment on a couple things. One that just came up that you brought up. I think the question of white supremacy and the what I call the arrow of privilege, the poison arrow, is the example you just gave. Like, black folk can't win on either side of the question of being elegant. So if you sound white and intelligent, then you sound intelligent. There's you should look on YouTube sometimes. I think your name is Kia Davis, and I know I've spoken about this before. She says, white people say gargantuan. I say big as shit. Now, is she not as articulate? Yes, she is as articulate. And so there's, even within the contradiction of language, there's this horrible, horrible thing of, you know, you'll be intelligent, you know, you're really a smart black person, right? Because you articulated the way white people feel comfortable in their articulation. On the other hand, you do have Amos and Andy where people are being made fun of. It's like, it's so fucked up to be, can I say that word?
Yeah.
It's too late.
Yeah,
I can't say it.
No.
You can't
We're
say
gonna
it.
black that out. Go
Okay,
ahead.
we're gonna white it out.
Blank. We're gonna blank that.
Is that you can't win. That's the viciousness of white privilege, and for black folk in particular. And I think it's true of people of color, but black folk have a particular, you know, they were brought here as slaves. That's a very different oppression than everybody else. So I just wanted to say that. So I was thinking about what to say, and so I wanted to give some examples. I think that's the best way to do it. On the two examples, and some people have heard these, of privilege. I had a young black man come to me. He had long dreads. This was in the 90s. He was going to take an internship at a law firm. And he said to me, Mr. G, that's what they called me, should I cut my dreads? Like, can I say hell? You can? Okay, you can't say hell either.
Just say heck.
Heck.
Okay, we can do that.
That's just so white, I don't know.
It is.
I said to him, I don't know what to say here. Like, cut your dreads? Oh, that's really great. You're going to cut your culture, or leave your dreads and maybe you won't get a job. Maybe you won't get the internship because of the way they look at you. So there was a good example. Like, my privilege is I wear earrings, right? I could just take these earrings off. I can look as white as everybody else. Maybe not act as calm as everybody else, but I know how to code switch pretty quickly. You can code switch, but you can't code switch your color or your hair. So that was him taking away his whole culture. Now, the good news is he kept his dreads, he got the internship, he is a lawyer now, right? And this is a kid from Roxbury. It's a great story. Now here's my story about what I did, where I think it comes out about coded language. I was working with a black teacher. I was his supervisor. And he was not doing a good job. He really was doing a terrible job. He was doing a disservice to the young people. And we had had many discussions about what he was doing and what he wasn't doing. But at one point in a discussion, I said to him, Jomo, you are being so lazy, it's beyond belief to me. And to say lazy as a white man to a black man is just so heavily coded that it doesn't matter that I wasn't directing him particularly at him, but in that moment I had lost complete consciousness. There were lots of other ways to say, I could have said, you're not doing your job. You're really letting these kids down. Let me show you all the reasons. But that came out of me because I wasn't actually thinking about anything except that situation. So that's me on a personal level. On a more kind of, quote, the political level, I do think there are things that we can support. And at different times, they mean different things. So for instance, in Boston, when I was a principal, they did the layoffs, and who gets laid off, right? Black folk and young folk. So my school looked very different before that. So the idea of, quote, super seniority, the idea of like, we're seeing that there's actual privilege in this society and that we can take a political stand, on a personal and a political level. And then in this new movement, though the Democratic Party does not want to talk about climate change, have you all seen that? They won't even debate it now. But given what's going on in society, there is this question of climate change, and then there's the question of how it affects particularly people of color and what that looks like. So that when you're in a movement, and I agree with everything everybody else said, by the way, in terms of listening, but raising these issues where privilege and race comes out I think is really important. So it's on a personal level, noticing it, and then on a political level, where are there elements where I need to be able to say, I need to take a stand here. And that stand may not be comfortable for a lot of folks, but it's still the right thing to do.
This whole issue of comfort is, that's going to become the real problem whenever we say comfort, or discomfort, because we can't do it. That's not going to stand.
Right.
We're not going to make everybody comfortable. In fact, because my lived experience and what comes out of me, if I want to be authentic, that's what comes out of me. And I have every right and an obligation to be who I am. Mm-hmm. And so your comfort or discomfort, you have to work with it. I'm not saying get over it. Engage with me. Mm-hmm. Engage with that discomfort. Say this is making me uncomfortable, but I'm hanging in there. And when you start to cry, I'm not going to take care of you. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to happen. But we're going to do all of these things, and we're going to do all of these things together. Let me ask a question now for the whole panel. So you all have worked in different arenas. And I think the most important thing that we can ask in this short time frame that we have is, what's the most important thing that, if listening is one, and not assuming anything, it's one of the four agreements, don't assume anything, but listening, but what else is important as you think about white people and finding a way into engaging in collaborations with black people in particular?
There's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and this conversation is only reinforcing it. Excuse me. Allergies. One other thing I forgot to self-identify is that I'm gay, and today is the 50th anniversary of Stone. Well, yeah, thank you. And could be down there. Could be down there. But one thing that's happening right now, this is where I'm going with this, is that there's a group of white men that want to have a straight pride parade. And I want to talk about that because this is, I think, one of the biggest problems, and this has to do with white people confronting white people about their racism, right? One of the fastest things that happens when we do this is we without intending to do it, we're playing the blame, shame, judgment game. And what the reaction usually is self-victimization. That's what, you know, we are victims of black racism, you know. And that becomes a great distraction. It's a tactic, actually. You know, Trump wants to be impeached. He wants to become victim, right? And campaign on his being assaulted, right? As an impeachable president. This business of white people assuming that we're the victims now of all of this wokeness is something we have to be really, really careful about and confront, right? And that, I think, it's a real challenge. And I'm seeing this in the work we're doing more and more. That's what I meant by this odd cultural moment about intent means nothing, impact, perceived impact, and facts be damned, right, is a very difficult situation to be in right now. And my white colleagues often, when they say, but, trying to explain, I'm not a racist, that's not what I meant, I'm trying to be helpful, and all of a sudden, they feel like they're the problem, and we are the problem, and that's an acknowledgement, and then they immediately go, instead of acknowledging how am I the problem, what can I do about that, they self-victimize, and I think that's got to be watched very carefully. It's a trick.
What do you do when that happens? It happens a lot. So what do white people do when that happens?
Name it, first of all.
Okay. Identify.
And smack him upside the head in the middle of next week.
That usually doesn't help.
Or
I think you have to be patient and gentle, but insistent. And you're going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If you're challenging anything about race, about a white person's behavior, actions, whatever, attitudes, speech, you're going to be uncomfortable. You better be ready to be uncomfortable.
And I think finding ways to, the temptation is to step up and go front. And I think there are places where this is appropriate. But if you want to change the narrative deeply, you have to find ways to go that will help people along. There are the crazy, they will not replace it people. And then there's the bulk of people who are happily moving along unaffected by any of this. So I will give an example of something that I did some years ago. I taught for a long time at a very large local private school in the lower school. And we went through a process in the late 70s of doing meetings with the faculty to talk about race and how that affected teaching and so on. And I did a presentation, and I realized that most of the people, they were all kind of contemporaneous with me or slightly older, were not going to be able to hear very well the present situation as it made them feel guilty, and they just shut down. So in looking at stereotypes, I brought in a bunch of cartoons that had been made during World War II with Japanese people with big glasses and buck teeth, and they were really horrible. And so I said, here's how somebody, and then we had a number of Japanese children in the school, in the lower school, and I said, how does this affect us? So skip ahead a few weeks, and one of the teachers comes to me and says, and she was a difficult person, I was reading Rabbit Hill by Robert Lawson. Lovely story, except in the middle of it, there is this Aunt Jemima character doing kind of the Amos and Andy thing in the book. And she said, I was reading this to my class, and she said, I looked out and there was so-and-so and so-and-so, two black children in her class. She said, I can't read this anymore. Thank you. So I felt like by shifting the narrative away from what we expected, it was equally bad what we did to the Japanese, but it reset things so that they could think about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really difficult one to fully, what's the best way to do it. I think it does. I think you got to vibe with different people. Like if you're just straight up racist, then we're going to have a different kind of discussion. Or I could tell stories about having those kind. But those aren't the people we're really talking about. the 35% who are the Trump base, I'm not having it with them. That's just a different crowd. But for honest white people who have this fragility about like being exposed, oh my God, I have these racist ideas, or I act in racist ways. I think it is, you don't want to shame them, but you want to have a difficult conversation. And that means pointing it out in concrete ways. Because if you point out in abstract ways, like, well, you have privilege, you know that. Like, it doesn't mean anything to somebody. It's when you can root it either in their experience or other experiences where they could see it. So, you know, something simple like, have you had to talk with your son or daughter about when a cop stops you? I mean, have you had that talk, Larry? And most white people are going to say, no, I have never had that talk. Wonder what that's all about, that you haven't had that talk. So, and so it's those kind of examples that you can root in real people's experience. And some people are going to say, yeah, and so what do you want me to do about it? Now, that's another discussion. But if I'm talking about rooting it and helping people see something, that's what I'm going to do. You know, there are any number of examples like that, right, that we could come up with. And that still doesn't take it far enough, right? But that's the beginning of the discussion about it.
So we're just about at the end of the time. So as I'm listening, I wanted to add, I always want to add something here. And so listen to this. Now, I'm not white, but I have worked in, I was very angry as a young person, all the way up for a long time. And so one of the biggest takeaways that I have is that when you're working with people and you've got a group of people, let's say this group is here today, interested, and then people tend to say, as you say, okay, now we've got this issue, now how do we address that? And then people start to stand up and they say, you're preaching to the choir here, don't talk to us, you need to get out there and talk to all those other people. So I don't believe that, to me, I mean, some people can spend their limited energy that they have on this earth going out and trying to reach the fringes. That's not my approach. My approach is here, us, and all of you, let's become, we start small, we're a group, and we start to uncover and unpack our own racism. We start to uncover how we support and believe and think white supremacist thoughts, and then we let that spread out so that each of you then gets to understand that better. And you go home and around the dinner table, you bring up the conversation, and you start to bring in like-minded people. So that, to me, is bring in like-minded people, and let all the like-minded people start to bring in other people. Let's not spend our limited energy on this earth trying to reach to the outskirts of the white supremacist movement. Thank you very much, and that is white supremacy, where we go from here. I hope you've heard some things that prompt you to hear some more things. Thank you. And let's talk about race.